Hello, welcome to MHTV. We're really pleased to have you with us tonight. We're talking about a range of subjects. So we're talking about LGBTQ plus, we're talking about substance use, we're talking about treatment experiences, we're talking about some of the inequalities that we can encounter and perhaps some of the things that we can do in order to be responsive to that. So we'd love to hear from you. And so to do that, let me hand over to Dave and he'll tell you how you can join in tonight.
Yeah, thanks, Nicky. Hi, everyone. It's great to be joining in tonight. We've got a couple of ways people can join in as usual. The first is on Facebook Live. Obviously, watching on there, if you just head towards the right, there should be a place for you to make your comments and questions. If you're over on X, then all you need to do is make sure you include the hashtag MHTV, and then we'll be able to see any questions or comments that you're mentioning. And obviously, we can try and bring those into tonight's conversation. Without further ado, back to you, Nick.
Yeah, so let's introduce you to Shannon then. So Shannon's PhD student, a researcher, just basically doing everything, and particularly focusing on intimate partner violence for gay and bisexual men. So we really do want to hear from you. So can you tell us a little bit about yourself then, Shannon?
Yeah, certainly. Well, thanks for having me on. I'm really excited to sort of talk about my job and my PhD and a little bit of just everything what I've been doing. So as Nicky just said, that I'm a doctoral student at Cardiff University, conducting research into young gay and bi men's experiences of intimate partner violence. I'm also a research assistant within the substance use research group at the University of South Wales. I'm originally from Northern Ireland, but I moved to Wales about 10 years ago now, I think. I do have a background in mental health, so I worked previously in community mental health services with complex trauma survivors, and that was before I did my PhD.
Yeah, so how did you come to find your pathway into study, particularly focusing on these issues?
So basically, I mean, I've always had an interest, I guess, in criminology, because that was sort of what I did as my degree and my master's and things like that. And then I kind of got into it. I came across a few researchers, Ben Hine, Elizabeth Bates, and an activist, a former activist known as Erin Pitsey. So she actually opened the first women's refuge in the UK. And I began sort of listening to various talks and stuff. And she was, talking a lot about men's experiences of IPV as well. And Ben Hine and Liz Bates touched a lot upon LGBTQ plus people's experiences. So that kind of got me started, and then I kind of went down this rabbit hole, and it kind of made me consider why, we still have this general narrative around relationship abuse. It kind of is based on the gendered perspectives, and that excludes a lot of minoritized groups. I also have close friends in the LGBTQ plus community that have survived abusive relationships and family and stuff as well, and they have lacked affirming support. So I think that's basically where it all stemmed from. And then it's acknowledging that it's not about taking away from the fact that we know that 1.3 million women experience domestic violence, and it's 1 in 6 women and 1 in 4 men, which that's an important statistic, and it's not about taking away from that, and or I guess you could say about taking from Peter to pay Paul, if that makes sense. It's about, I guess, making access to help and support equitable, regardless of your identity. So yeah, I guess that's it in a nutshell, and then I kind of just went from there.
I think you're making a really valid point just straight out the gate there about this weird belief that somehow there's only this much care or this much support or this much compassion, and then when it runs out, then people just have to make do. Or that somehow for one person to be treated with fairness, compassion and safety means that other people are going to just have to get by. And it's such a strange idea, isn't it? We don't really ration compassion in other services like that. We don't say, oh, well, everyone who's had a heart attack, we've only got this much, and then if you have a heart attack and you belong to a different group, then you can't really get any treatment.
Yes, yeah.
And it's a really odd idea, isn't it? I think you're right to say that it's a matter of equity. So why do you think that it happens, and what's the consequence.
So I guess before I touch upon that, I kind of just wanted to add one of the interesting things, just sort of to I guess touch upon the politicized nature of this, is that when I went to, well, I approached people in the university and sort of said that I was interested in this topic, and the initial response was very much, well, more women experience it, and my response was, I'm not saying that. It's more about, should we not research a problem, or should we not look into a problem just because there's higher numbers in this group and less numbers in that group? It's, we don't do that for homicide, for example, things like that, but yeah, so I just kind of wanted to say that. And what was your question again there? Sorry.
Yeah, why is it, do you think, that some people are overlooked?
I mean, I think, as I said, like, I think because we have these sort of traditional narratives, through society, that we focus heavily on physical violence perpetrated by men against women and girls in opposite sex relationships, and that that can exclude other gender identities and other sexual orientations, and also other forms of abuse that aren't physical. I also think that there are some problematic attitudes that maybe minimize the psychological, emotional, or verbal abuse in relationships. If there is that assumption that domestic violence must mean physical, then that does tend to overlook very real suffering. I do think as well that one of the big things, and certainly in my PhD I found this, is discrimination and stigma. So minoritized groups, as you know, can imagine, LGBTQ plus people often, they fear, if not face directly, discrimination when seeking support after like an abusive relationship, and that then ultimately leads people to stay silent. They're not going to want to come forward because they're they're going to risk the judgment. And then I guess finally, one of the other big problems is we simply don't have enough data or research on this issue. I was approached recently by someone else who's doing a PhD on a similar topic, and they had actually been provided with my name because I'm one of the only people, or one of the very few, sorry, in the UK that is actually looking at this, which I think is crazy in 2024. But okay. But yeah, so until very recently, I'd say the last 10-15 years there has been more being done, but it's still very limited. And it does, all of the research that is coming out, and even the policies and legislation and things like that, all predominantly focus on cisgender heterosexual relationships, which obviously then perpetrates our assumptions and then overlooks diverse relationship dynamics. Yeah, so I mean, I guess that then sort of feeds back then to the the societal assumptions that we have about traditional relationships, the dynamics and roles that that are in the household. But yeah, so basically I kind of am aiming to sort of highlight, I guess you could say, underrepresented voices, because I think it's really important that we have more compassionate and equitable systems of support for all survivors, regardless of what their identity or situation or whatever. I
think you pointed out some of the things around kind of like the stigma, and I certainly don't think if I was a young gay man I would want to go into a police station and report domestic violence. I think that would be really tough, regardless of how people treated me. I think that would be really quite a frightening thing to have to do. I wonder if there's some other, I mean, not only is there this sort of stigma going on and the invisibility, so people don't know to ask and don't know to look, but I guess I wonder, is there something around the way that people see men as, you should be able to take a punch, or like fighting is something that shouldn't be as shocking to you as it is for a woman, or equal partners taking a chop out of each other isn't the same as a big person and a little person? Are there that kind of narrative playing at all?
Yeah, absolutely. So I I ran a survey part of my PhD, and then I also did repeated interviews with 8 survivors. And along with that, then I also used a creative method known as photo elicitation. And so in the interviews, the men sort of discussed, the whole idea was for them to sort of freely discuss their stories. And then if they wanted, they could come back and they could do a photo elicitation session with me. And what that entailed was they could bring 5 to 10 photographs that they felt represent their experiences of domestic violence. And often, and if I would say every single one of them actually, they all said very similar things, that those that did reach out to the police or other sort of services or authorities were met with, I guess, very negative responses. So like in one situation, the police just put it down to 2 men fighting, even though the person was, you know, was extremely violent, and you know, it was a really horrific, significant abuse. This is what we're talking about here. It's not, you know, insignificant, and that's often the thing. I think any of the research that I've read before, it kind of states that, you know, with gay and bi men, it's, you know, they don't experience as significant abuse as women and things like that. And I don't think it's really helpful to have, you know, those kinds of viewpoints, because then, you know, I feel like that's very untrue, but particularly now that I've interviewed people and I'm hearing their stories, and a lot of them are telling me that if someone had just asked them, are they okay? You know, do they need help? They would have. I mean, we're talking about people that were in relationships for maybe a decade, and they were repeatedly going into A&E, repeatedly having the police at their home, and nothing happened. No one happened.
I think, I mean, and I think you're right as well to say that, you know, this idea about judging risk on damage, physical damage, it really overlooks the kind of emotional betrayal that's happening.
Yeah.
And the fact that, you know, how do you even, if you're not safe in your house, how do you sleep? How do you function when you're sort of like on hyper arousal, hyper alert the whole time? It's just
Yeah. I mean, that's the thing. I mean,
terrible.
like with this research, a lot of I guess many academics use the term hidden victims.
Yeah.
And for me, I don't particularly like that term, because it contributes unintentionally to the issue of overlooking certain groups. So the key is using language that, I guess, conveys the responsibility lies with the systems and the services that fail to see and serve these groups, rather than, you know, an inherent invisibility. These people are not invisible. They're very visible. They're just,
Yeah, they're in and out of A&E and they're reporting.
yeah.
You're not invisible, are you? You're just not looked at.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, so like in my ideal world, no person seeking help after abuse should be turned away or feel unwelcome to ask for help. I mean, you know, I just think that, as I said, we're in 2024. This needs to be acknowledged. It's happening. You know, certainly I know, this might be anecdotal, but I know that you're either a victim survivor or you know someone that is, and that, you know, that's a very real thing.
Yeah, and I think it's a very strange thing, isn't it? It's a sort of other an emotional relationship, a connection, to say that it's different somehow inherently.
Yes.
It's not different. If people are hurt within the space of a relationship, all of the physical, all of the mental, all of the emotional pain is exactly the same, because it's human beings.
Yes. Yeah.
It's interesting, isn't it, that people sort of struggle to get their head around that a little bit.
Yeah. I mean, there are so many parallels between LGBTQ plus people's experiences and heterosexual cisgender people, and that includes the impact that it has on the survivors as well. And you know, although there are very many similarities, there also are unique differences. So you might have people that have their sexual gender identity used against them as a tactic by an abuser to sort of keep the power and control in the relationship. You have things like outing, which is a form of coercive control.
Yeah.
That, you know, that's when a partner threatens to out you in relation to your sexual identity, to like family, friends, work colleagues. But yeah, I mean, the prevalence rates within LGBTQ plus relationships are very, very similar.
So what are the other, I mean, I think you're right to sort of talk as well about that idea that there is that other additional dimension that somebody might not be public about their either their relationship status or their personal sexuality, and nor should they be. But I think it's really interesting, the idea that you've got that secrecy and that fear that can play into that as well from the very person who should be on your side and should protect you. So some of the other things that you were looking at how people cope as well, because obviously the system isn't doing a fantastic job either asking after people or supporting people or providing safe places.
Yeah, yeah.
So how are people getting by?
So,
Yeah.
well, most of the time they are not. So the people that I interviewed, none of them, sorry, one of them out of the 8 had sought support. The rest haven't, and in fact, in a few cases, I was the first person that they have ever talked to about their experiences.
Mm.
Many of them have never had relationships again because they don't want to put their trust into someone else because they're fearful that it might happen again. And it seems to be the case that a lot of the people I interviewed were in their, I guess, 40s and upwards, and the abuse that they experienced happened maybe when they were in their 20s. So they're talking to me retrospectively about their experiences. But a lot of them have had to sort of cope with all of this trauma, and they've never had a release. And so speaking to me, I think, well, they told me that they thought that it was, very, very therapeutic, and it was a chance to sort of have a non-judgmental conversation about their experiences and about the issues that we have with the availability of services and the fact that there's very little refuge and things for gay and bi men. But yeah,
it's
sorry.
vital, isn't it, that this is research? But I can imagine, like, if you're dealing with what's essentially very deep-seated long-term trauma for a lot of people, that's going to be quite challenging for you ethically and personally as a researcher. So how has that worked?
Yes, so that's one of the challenges in research anyway. It's making sure that you have, boundaries, and you want to be personable, but you can't, you also can't be a counselor because that's not your job role. So yeah, it is a challenge, and I think the best thing is just to obviously be human and be affirmative and things like that, but all you can do is, I guess, signpost and make sure that you think that they're safe to talk to you, and that you can then go on and give them uh, information for the relevant services that they may need after speaking to me. But that was one of the reasons why I opted to have repeated interviews, because I understand that meeting someone for the first time, you're not going to want to talk to a stranger necessarily about these things that have happened to you. So I wanted to kind of do it slowly and at their own pace. I wanted them to have as much agency, control over the interview format, and that was certainly the case as well with when I did the photo elicitation part. So they brought, as I said, 5 to 10 photographs, and then they were able to choose which order the photographs were used, and then they could sort of talk through them, and that was a really, really good method, and that's not something that's been really done at all with men or gay or bi men. So that was interesting, and I think they really enjoyed it too. So that's something I want to explore further.
You've got some really interesting sort of like things I think that other researchers can learn from in terms of method.
Yes, yeah.
The kind of safety stuff needs to be primary.
Yes, yeah.
You having a past history and working in mental health and trauma has actually set you up to know what's coming, because you can't ask people to share that kind of information without it having an impact to them and to the person who hears it, because it's good, really.
Yeah. And
it's important.
Exactly, and that's why it's so important to have your debrief sessions. And even as well for myself as a researcher, I think it's really important that researchers acknowledge that we can have, we are people and we have feelings too, and we need to offload, and so my supervisors were sort of my point of contact, that if I have, if I felt I needed a debrief, then I could do that as well.
It's really important, isn't it, for that? So I think sometimes this kind of like ideal vision of research is the researcher is like this neutral petri dish, and like saying, no, they're a human being who's hearing this,
Yeah.
and it's troubling, and also it's something that you can't just hear and then forget about. You've got to actually go over it and hear it over and over again in order to sort of look at what your data is, and it is really quite complicated.
Yeah.
I thought one of the ideas as well about giving people agency is really important, particularly when you're talking and working with people who've had their power taken away from them and their voice taken away from them. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So that was kind of my goal from the outset. I wanted to try and put the people with lived experience in sort of the driver's seat, and I wanted them to have full control over how the flow of the interview went. So obviously I had my interview schedule and things like that. But I kind of I wanted them to feel like they could stop the interview anytime. Those things were very important. If they needed a pause, they needed a break. If they needed to just end the interview and come back at a later date, that was totally fine as well. So that was one of the big things that I really pressed upon them. And yes, so we had the multiple interviews. So we had initial introductory interviews with kind of breaker sessions, to sort of just chat.
And you saw people individually, not as a group.
Yeah, individually. Yeah. So giving them a little bit about myself as well, and was kind of open and honest about, I know people that have experienced things. When I was a child, I grew up for a number of years in a domestic violence household. So it's personal to me as well, although I know it's not the same, but I kind of just wanted to relate to people on a way that, and then so we built it from there, the relationship, and then eventually then on the second or third interview we would then do the proper interview, and then I would just let them freely talk about their experiences, and they could start at any point, whether it was the end or the middle, it didn't really matter, because we could go back and forth, and that seemed to work really well. And obviously I had prompts and things like that, and then once that session finished, we had a debrief. I thought it was very important at the end of every interview to ask feedback on how they thought the interview went. If there was any questions that they didn't like, if there was questions that they thought could be changed or anything like that, I wanted it to sort of be as iterative as possible. And that was, I think that was a really useful method, because it gave me sort of the tools that I needed then to make this process as easy as possible for the survivors that I was talking to. And then we did the photo elicitation session if they felt comfortable with that. So only 2 people out of the 8 took part in that. I would have liked to have used it more, but of course that's something I'd like to do more in the future. And then again,
it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because you're allowing people a different way of expressing themselves. And sometimes there are things, I think, particularly if you haven't had the chance to talk about something that's happened to you, and there's no patterns that you've seen, particularly in public discourse or on television, it can be quite hard to find the words for things, I think, or even to sort of name and express what's happening to you.
Yeah, totally. And I think that the use of the photos was really, really beneficial, because in the initial, I guess, more semi-structured conversational interview, it was obviously, even though they could freely talk, it was more structured in a sense, whereas with the photographs, we had already sort of talked about everything, so it was just that certain in events or instances that are things that happened, and they could say, right, in this photograph you could see X, and this shows what happened on this day, and then it would open up all of these emotions and maybe thoughts and memories that they wouldn't have necessarily have come up with.
Because verbal pathway is one sort of unlocking, isn't it? When you actually use other senses, you unlock more memory, I think.
Yeah, that's the thing. And so I think that was, I think it was a really, really powerful method. And it seemed to resonate really well, and I know that a few of them thought that it was very therapeutic and made them sort of consider their experiences differently. I guess in a way the images kind of externalized their experiences because they were looking at it outside of themselves, if that makes sense.
It does. And I think if you've got an experience that's so painful that like that, and it's not something you see represented, you get to a point where you can't always remember its reality almost, because it's such a big secret and there's no one to talk to.
Yes, yeah.
And it's really hard to process it, I think, under those circumstances. So yeah, really interesting work. What were sort of like, are you at a stage where you can think about themes or patterns or coping methods or anything yet, or not quite?
So I'm just at the process of, I've analyzed the data and I'm at the process of writing it up. So I can sort of speak briefly about it because it's at the early stages. The goal is to have it written up by the autumn time, the entire thesis, but you know, I might be being a little bit ambitious.
Good to have a goal.
But yeah, so in terms of, I would say all of them experienced very similar patterns of abuse. So we had at least three of them came actually from countries outside of the UK. And they moved to various locations in England and such, and got into relationships with a older person, and it seemed to be the case in every situation, which I thought was interesting.
Interesting use of the word interesting there, doing a lot of heavy lifting there, Shannon. No, here to church, go on.
But yeah, I mean, yeah, so they were all younger and going out with an older person. And as English was not always their first language, there was instances where their partners would use that as a way to abuse them. So maybe they would put them down. They would say, you know, that their English wasn't good enough, you know, things like that. So that was something that occurred, and a few outing was something as well that that did occur, but only in one of the survivor stories. So the rest of them, everyone, the rest of the survivors have all been out to their communities and their family and friends, so there was no issues with that. What else?
You're looking at a lot of power play, aren't you? And a lot of the exploitation of disadvantage.
Yes. That was one of the biggest things, problems around masculinity as well, and internalized homophobia. So on a few of the cases, religion was a big factor, and that caused a lot of problems and sort of toxic dynamics within some of the relationships as well.
I mean, that is one of the things about stigma that's most pernicious, isn't it? It's one thing if you're getting hostility and negative messages from outside, but when that sort of poison actually creeps inside you and you start to hate yourself and hate people who like you, and that's when I think you see the most poisonous outcomes.
I think one of the big sort of takeaways from this is that although they didn't reach out for help and support, the abuse that they experienced was significant horrific forms of physical abuse, and also like psychological sexual abuse as well, and financial abuse as well. Excuse me. And the literature, when you read it, will tell you that, you know, no, they don't experience as significant forms of abuse, and you know, there'll be a lot of narratives and things that say otherwise, and that's just not what I find.
I find it very strange when you get these narratives and then you go to dig into them and you're like, based on nothing. No research has been done in this area. No one can successfully state what is and isn't happening for people, or whether something is indeed a problem or not, if you haven't even looked.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about some of because we've talked about the kind of nature of the experience, and in some ways, domestic abuse and interpersonal violence is interpersonal violence. There are some things that are specific to this community because of the negativity and stereotypes and stigma that exists in society, which make things more complicated. What about how people can get support and the need for tailored support for this group?
So there are the support that is available is limited, but there are certainly in Wales, where I'm based, there are a few tailored services for LGBTQ plus people to go, and
Mm,
they're sort of peer-led services. So you can go. There's one called Callan DVS. They you will go and you'll go through for a few sessions, and then they will train you up, and you can become a peer, and then
mm,
you can go out and help others as well. So that is a really successful organization, and it's a really, really good,
mm,
valuable organization here in Wales. In terms of England, most of the services are sort of more in your, I guess, larger cities like London and things like that.
mhm,
So you have things like Gallup,
mhm,
London Friend, Broken Rainbow, a few services such as those. And I know that they do offer support for people experiencing domestic abuse, but the support that's offered, like a lot of the people that I've spoke to have said that they don't want to phone a helpline. They don't want to do that kind of thing. They want to actually be able to go and speak to someone and have someone that understands their
mm,
experiences, understands their gender or sexual identity. They don't want to have to go and explain themselves or explain why they're in the relationship that they're in and things like that.
mm.
And that's totally understandable. I mean, a lot of
Yeah.
people that have access services have had like negative experiences, and they have had people that have been judgmental, have discriminated against them. And obviously when you're going and you're a shell of a person, you've been in this really
Mm,
abusive relationship. You don't then want to then, when you're reaching out to someone, when you might be at your lowest point, to then have to explain your very existence, like of why you are the way you are.
mm,
um and I think that's often people's experiences when they do. And I'm not saying that, you know I'm not here to say that services, are terrible and things like that. And I
yeah.
know that staff work hard, and as myself, I've worked in mental health services and stuff, and I know the pressure that people are under, and I know that everything is underfunded and overstretched, and certainly since COVID, that's been even more of a problem.
Mm,
So yeah, it's not about saying that the services and the staff that we have are inadequate or anything like that. It's just about saying that improvements need to be made, and people in this sort of day and age should feel like they can reach out for help and support if they need it.
yeah. I think one of the big changes would be people actually looking out for this instead of making the assumption that everything's going to be fine.
Yes,
Or
yeah,
having in their head, this is what this looks like. And if it doesn't look like this, then it's not that problem.
yes, yeah.
Yeah. Even just asking is going to make a difference, isn't it?
Yeah, that's the thing. And that's what was said to me. If someone had just asked,
Mm,
"Are you okay? Do you need help?" That
mm,
would have been it.
mm. And is there, I mean, as well, there's that other sort of issue that is amazing and excellent that people are experiencing peer-led services. Quite
Yes.
frankly, if you pay your taxes, you should get some statutory services too. But that's by the by. We've talked about that. But I wonder if there's some issues as well with going to people who know you from your community. If you want to keep things like the experience of violence private, how you manage that as well, because you presumably are in quite small circles, particularly outside London and the bigger cities.
Yes, I think that's certainly a good point. Although, I mean, I guess if you reached out to a service
Mm,
in, say, the one I mentioned, Cal and DVS in
yeah.
Wales, I don't know if they would necessarily know who you are. But then, I mean,
Mm,
that might be the risk that you'd have to take, I guess,
mm,
in reaching out for help and support.
mm. Better to ask, isn't it? It's better to actually do that.
Yeah.
Was there anything in terms of people's sort of personal coping strategies? Because sometimes we find that people trying to manage or medicate pain can get themselves
Yes.
into other types of trouble as well.
Yes. So
Mm,
some of the things that was found was sort of negative, a lot of negative sort of coping strategies. and I guess they externalize their trauma by using alcohol, drugs, maybe getting them people engaging in risky sort of sexual behaviors and things like that. That was some of the big things. Obviously, people's mental health was completely destroyed. And yeah, I mean, just getting themselves into some risky situations. And
You're describing like classic trauma responses, though, aren't you?
yes,
It's really
yeah,
interesting when people suggest that same-sex couples don't experience like the kind of trauma that everybody else does. It's like, well, weirdly, they do seem to be, and all the symptoms are the same. So let's just say that they are having that experience. Yeah. And I mean, as well, one of the ones that I think is most sort of telling is that rehearsing risky behavior, be it sexual or just trying to see if you can get a different result doing the same thing, or whether it's has happened to you because there's something wrong with you, or whether this happens to everybody. And you get a lot of professionals can be very judgmental around that. And for me, I mean, it's not something I've done, but I absolutely understand why somebody plays a situation over and over again trying to get a different outcome. It makes such a lot of sense to me. I'm always quite surprised when you hear people being quite terse about it. Yeah. And I guess the other thing you're saying about sort of people trying to manage their distress, numbing themselves or distracting themselves with drugs and alcohol, that's going to make some people experience them as unreliable witnesses to their own bodies.
Yes, yeah.
That's going to make it even harder, I think, for them to be able to lodge complaints, to keep themselves safe.
Yeah. I mean, and you know, one of the big issues as well, because of this, I guess, framing of domestic abuse in society as being only against women and girls, is that most of the survivors I spoke to never really considered that they were experiencing domestic abuse until maybe even sometimes after they had left the relationship, or if it wasn't for someone like a friend or a family member pointing out to them, because they just thought that this was normal. This is what happens in relationships.
Relationships get heated. Yeah, but I mean, like it's there's two or three things going on there, isn't there? Because I think that can be true for a lot of people engaged in abusive relationships. I had someone commenting the other day, it's being aside, but we're there, so let's chat about it anyway. Talking about it was looking at some older men talking about their relationships with younger people, you know, so and almost getting kind of kudos for going out with 22-year-olds and things like that. And the same, if you ever ask a 22-year-old when they're older about their relationship with someone who's much older than them, they're always like, it was the worst. Like, so, you know, there's that really interesting objectification, isn't there? And as soon as the object gets a chance to speak, they're like, this is not working. And it's and certainly not all age discrepancy relationships are like that, but where power is weaponized, it always ends up being a problem.
Yeah. And I think like that's one of the main things as well that I'm kind of trying to take away from all of this, is that domestic abuse or intimate partner violence is not necessarily a gendered issue always. It's all about power and control, and anybody can be on the end of that. And I think certainly with my research, I know that the people that I interviewed, it was very much power and control that was at the center. It was everything. The fact that their language, if they were originally from outside of the UK, that
Any
was
kind of dependency, any kind of
anything
used.
it was used, and I think that's important to consider.
I think so too. I can see that time has really got away from me.
No.
I was like, how did that happen? Dave, is there anything that you wanted to say? I appreciate that, we brought you in and then totally ignored you for the whole of this conversation.
I'm sure you'll appreciate sometimes they're the most interesting sessions for me, that even though I'm kind of just in the corner of the screen, just kind of really listening in and sort of trying to follow the conversation. So, no, I don't think there's anything particular I wanted to add, Nicky. Just, obviously it's been really interesting listening to the conversation this evening.
Yeah. And Shannon, is there anything you sort of wanted to leave people with? You've brought up some really interesting and important things about the nature of this kind of research, how important it is, some of the good practice, thinking about how people can be overlooked, and we need to ask questions, we need to be more curious, and also some of the issues and the need for tailored support. Is there anything else that you want to offer before we finish up?
I think I think that services that are willing to learn, adapt, and grow and they can successfully, they can, from that they can successfully create welcoming environments for LGBTQ plus people. Small steps, that's all it is, towards inclusion, will ultimately enable greater access to support communities that have felt left out for far too long.
Yeah, I think so. It's just so important, isn't it, for us to keep our eyes open and check in on each other. So
Yes.
thank you very much for that, Shannon. I really appreciate you doing this in your own time. Very, very much appreciated. And I guess it just remains for us to say good night and thanks very much.
Thank you very much.
Night all.
Night.